We're ready to begin segment 6 of my series entitled From Dissociation to Perfection as Revealed in Judah. We're getting into the very deepest secrets of the end times and the second coming of Christ. It's been difficult to break this up into segments because the verses are all so interconnected, each one flowing into the next one in the Revelation. And so what I'm going to do here is just give a brief review of what the previous section was about. In Genesis 38:15 through 19, which was the fifth segment of the series, we found that this person living in the end times, typified by Judah, had an inferior concept of Christ. He saw him as one to meet his needs, and that was the meaning of harlot. A harlot is someone an evil man would go to have his needs met. And so this is a very inferior concept that most of us come to Christ with, a desire for him to meet our needs. By using his imagination to envision Christ, he is receiving a higher vision of who Christ is. He's beginning to set his affection on things above, not on things on the earth. In his desire for oneness in Christ, he offers to give up his browsing in worldly things. That was the kid. A kid is a goat who browses around and nibbles on this, that, and the other thing. And that was that part of us that just browses around in things of the world, internet surfing, channel surfing, whatever. So he was willing to give up all that for the Lord. But Christ wants something far deeper. The Lord wants him to trust him for his identity, his security, and the control of his life. This is far deeper than just giving up some habits or just some worldly things that we like to dabble in from time to time. Then Judah experiences the presence of the Lord in his body as the quickening of his mortal body. This was because he was willing to give all these things over to the Lord, his identity, his security, and the control of his life. And so Judah is experiencing this marvelous presence of the Lord in the quickening of his mortal body, which has to do with the awakening of the spiritual body that the natural body feels, because they are connected. And then, after a brief period of really enjoying this wonderful feeling, the Lord lets him know that he's going to have to go through his final cross. And in this time, he will no longer feel the presence of the Lord. The Lord will not have left him. He'll still be with him. But he will not perceive the Lord in the way that he has. And this is so the Lord can do a final work in his life that we're going to see revealed to us here in the next few verses of Genesis 38. In beginning this next verse, Genesis 38:20, Judah has just lost the sense of the Lord's presence that was so powerful in his body, and he's going through his final cross experience. And so this is his response to having lost the sensation of the Lord's presence. The Lord is still with him, but he doesn't feel his presence anymore. And so the first thing he does is to send away the kid. Now, the kid, as you'll remember, represented our browsing in things of the world, just hobbies and pastimes, computer games, just things that we might mindlessly do. But he sent that away. He's not doing it anymore. He sent it away by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite. The Adullamite, if you'll remember, was the false persona that he took on in the very beginning of Genesis 38, when the true self went down and split away from his mainstream of consciousness, and his identity was in the true self, so he didn't know who he was, and he put on then shame. Shame became his identity, and this was very painful for him to feel so inferior and so inadequate, and so he puts on a false persona in the friend, the Adullamite. This word friend here in the Hebrew is re'ah, and it means a very close friend. It could even be a relative. And so actually this is a part of Judah that's going away as he decides not to be involved any longer in the browsing in worldly things. He doesn't really realize that this is a false self or another part of his mind. He just knows that he doesn't want to do this anymore. He's desiring this new nature in Christ, and yet it hasn't come to him yet. Because as long as we have a false self, we will not have the fullness of the new nature. God is not going to give us this exchanged life. He's not going to let the nature of Christ come in and be the nature of our life as long as there's a part of us that is still false. So that has to be dealt with yet. In the next verse, here's what the Adullamite did. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, Where is the harlot that was openly by the wayside? And they said, There was no harlot in this place. Now in allegorical types, men are the understanding. And so this is an understanding that's coming into a part of Judah's mind that had not received it before. Once he stopped dabbling in these worldly things and pastimes, he began to realize in a deeper level that the Lord was not someone that was just there to meet his needs. This had been like a double-mindedness in him that is now gone away. And so he even realizes in this other part of his mind that the Lord was not someone there just to meet his needs. And so his whole concept of who God is has just grown deeper. In the previous verse, the false self was cleansed of his wrong concept of God. Sometimes the false self doesn't believe in God at all. But he could see that God was not someone that was just to meet his needs. And he's seeing God as something far greater than that. And now continuing on with this verse, and he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. And also the men of the place said that there was no harlot in this place. When he returned to Judah, this is saying that the false self has now joined into the true self. He has been merged into the true self. And now Judah, this person in living in the end times, typified by Judah, has become a whole person. He no longer has any divisions in his mind. If you'll remember Jacob's prophecy over Judah in Genesis 49, included this last part of verse 10, Unto him shall the gathering of the people be. It's to the true self that all the splits in our being will be gathered. When I deal with people who have been very seriously, savagely abused, and they have broken into many separate, distinct parts that seem like personalities in their own right, when I meet these and they tell me of what happened to them, sometimes I have to cast the demons out of them, but I always have to bring them to an understanding of who Jesus Christ is. And once they can see that he is the Son of God and he is what they truly want, once they have been cleansed of their inner vows that they've made, of their any allegiance to the devil, they've broken the judgments that they've made, they have replaced lies with truth, then they can merge into the true self. But for Judah, who is just a type of a person who's lost his true self, which would typify most people, it's just that he realizes that he can no longer think of Christ the way he had before. Even if he tries to think of him that way, he cannot. He has a whole new revelation of who Christ is. And it's far beyond just God being there to meet his needs. In fact, he's at the place now where he can say, Lord, I don't care what happens in life. Even if there's no blessing in my life, I still want you. I still want to be one with you. I want to come into your fullness. Whatever it takes, I'm willing to go through anything that I can have you at all costs. And going on with the next verse, and Judah said, Let her take it to her, lest we be shamed. Behold, I sent this kid, and thou hast not found her. So when he's saying, let her take it to her, I believe he's speaking here of the 3 items that he gave to Tamar, which symbolized our giving the Lord trust that our identity can be in him, and we trust him for our security, and we also are willing to give him control of our life. And so he realizes that he is no longer wants to take charge of this. He doesn't want it back. He wants the Lord to keep it. And he knows that if he would begin doing any of these things again, that he would just wind up in shame. So let her take it to her, lest we be shamed. He just doesn't want any of this back in his life again. He doesn't care what. He's not going to fall back into doing what he had been doing before. And he said, Behold, I sent this kid, and thou hast not found her. He's lost all interest in worldly things, and still he has not received back the presence of the Lord that he lost, but he's done all that he knows to do. It's all in God's hands, and he's coming into a kind of a rest here, because he knows, having done all, he is to stand, and that's what he's doing here. In preparing this slide for this presentation, I just had the revelation that I'm actually living it right now in regards to the signet, the bracelets, and the staff, my identity, my security, and my need for controlling. I have realized this has been bound up in my husband. And as a wife with my husband being the breadwinner in the home, his decision to go into the ministry years ago when he got back from Vietnam have determined much of the course of my life and somewhat who I am. And also he has been the breadwinner, and so my security has been in him. And I've also felt a need to control because he likes to do things that I consider dangerous, and I'm always praying for his safety and cautioning him to be careful, that sort of thing. And so it was just a few years ago, my husband said to me, Honey, I want to get a motorcycle. My response to that was, You've got to be kidding. I can't believe you just said that. But he went on and said, But I won't do it if it's not all right with you. And I said, Okay, I'll pray about it. And so I did. I prayed about it for close to a week. When I felt I had the Lord's answer that this was of God and it would be good for my husband to ride. He had a difficult childhood. He was controlled a lot. And this would be something very freeing for him. And so I said yes. And it has turned out to be a source of great joy for him. I tried to join into it with him. I rode on the back for a while, but I just didn't enjoy it. I wasn't comfortable. It wasn't a big touring bike. It was a sporty bike. I just wasn't comfortable on the back of it. I tried taking motorcycle riding course that I could get my own bike, but I fell down twice and injured my knee and skinned up my arm and decided this is not for me. And so I just had to say, Honey, that's your thing. You go and enjoy it, but it's not for me. And so I've had to trust the Lord for his safety when I could not be there to say, Don't you think you're going a little too fast? Or maybe you need to rest, or watch out for that car. There's nothing at all I could do to protect him when he's out on his motorcycle. And so I have been somewhat fearful, even though I know there's a call on his life that's not fulfilled yet, and I believe God has great plans for him. I've still been fearful. And so all last winter I prayed and asked God to help me give him my fears and concerns and to trust him totally with my husband. And now the weather is warm and he's out riding, and I realize I have a whole different attitude about it, and I'm not worried about him anymore. I have a new revelation of God and who he is, of his greatness and his love. And I also realize that some of my fears were based in my own need for my husband's security and for my identity that was found in him. And I've totally relinquished my need to control, and I've found now that my identity is in the Lord, my security is in the Lord, and I love my husband very, very much. So I'm not saying all my concern was for wrong motives, because I do adore him and would be devastated if anything happened to him. And yet I know if it did, that God is with me, and I would get through it, and I would be okay. And so I just see a whole new understanding in my life of God and my relationship with God and his care over my life. And it's so freeing. It's just so wonderful to have relinquished all of this to the Lord. And continuing on now with verse 24, and it came to pass about 3 months after, that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar thy daughter-in-law hath played the harlot, and also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, Bring her forth, and let her be burnt. There's a lot in this verse. I have divided it up into 4 parts, A, B, C, and D, in order to discuss each one separately. Part A, and it came to pass about 3 months after. 3 is the number of divine completeness and perfection. And what this is saying is, it is time for Judah to come into perfection. God has been working in him all along, and now it's time for the final work to be done to bring him into completeness and perfection. And part B, that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar thy daughter-in-law hath played the harlot. The word told in the Hebrew is nagad, and it means also to stand boldly out opposite. And then the words hath played are not in the Hebrew. And if you'll remember, our understanding of daughter-in-law according to the Hebrew, which is a bride, as perfect, means perfection. And Tamar, of course, as the type of Christ, and harlot was using God just to have our needs met. And so based on all of this, what this is saying here, that Judah understood that Christ was far more perfect than he had formerly perceived him to be. To stand out boldly opposite, that would be meaning daughter-in-law, which is perfection, and harlot, which is just someone to meet a person's desires, a man's desires. And so this stands out boldly opposite. His concept of God now, after all he's gone through, stands out boldly opposite of what he had first thought God to be, as just someone to answer his prayers for all the things that he wanted God to do. Going on with part C, and also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. Well, the one that God is carrying here into maturity is Judah. And he's going to be birthed in the image of Christ. And by whoredom is saying, even though Judah had such an inferior concept of God, that God was just someone there to meet his needs, the Lord still worked with him. The Lord still allowed him to feel his presence with that quickening of his mortal body. And now God is going to take him on into his fullness. And so there's such a realization here that this is all by the grace and goodness and mercy of God, that he's coming into this perfection and completion. And even though his concept of God was so inferior and so self-centered, the Lord still came to him and continued to work in him, knowing that at some point Judah would have a far greater understanding of just who God is. And part D, and Judah said, "Bring her forth, and let her be burnt." What this is saying is that Judah wants everything in him that is not of Christ to be burned. And this is the final step of removing the sin nature that came as a result of the fall. This is one of the biggest, most wonderful secrets of what God is doing as He returns for His bride that is without spot or wrinkle. He's going to remove the sin nature. And only God can do this. It's been in humankind ever since Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. And God is going to take it from us. And we're going to come into absolute perfection. This is the only way the bride could be without spot or wrinkle. As long as that sin nature indwells our flesh, we're always going to mess up somehow. We're going to come up with some false motive, and we're going to continue aging and growing weak and then dying. And God is going to bring this to an end. We're going to enter into a whole new dimension in Jesus Christ, reserved for the church of the end times. And I base this on many studies that I have done. Judah is not the only study that I have done in this depth. I've done many other passages, long passages, and it always shows me that God is going to remove the sin nature, and we will no longer be indwelt by sin. And so this is a marvelous work that God is doing here. It's something that we can look forward to, that will be worth whatever price we're asked to pay, which is, of course, our life, to die to self, to give up everything false and all the things of the world that we have clung to for our identity and our security. We have to give up control of our life, everything to the Lord. But it's just going to be so marvelous when God brings us into this fullness. Now I'd like to give a brief summary of this verse. And it came to pass about 3 months after means that it is time for Judah to come into perfection and completeness. And part B, that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot. And we talked about some of the Hebrew words that were not in this. And it was told means stand out boldly opposite. And so his concept of God that he has now is so much greater than when he just saw God as someone to meet his needs. And so it just stands out boldly opposite of what he had thought in the beginning. And part C, and also she is with child by whoredom, and saying that Christ had come to him and blessed him with the quickening of his mortal body, even when he had this inferior concept of God, that God was just someone there to meet his needs. And we don't have to come into this perfection and then get to experience God in this way, but God is going to come to us even when we have this inferior concept. And then God will work in us and do a great work to bring us into maturity. And the last one, and Judah said, Bring her forth and let her be burned. He wants everything that is not of God in him to be burned in final judgment. And so God is going to do that work in him. And it says that Judah wants it because Judah's going to have to participate in this. God is going to work with us in this. But everything in us not of God that will be burned up, God requires that we cooperate with him. This has to do with our diet and what we do with our leisure time. We're going to have to be disciplined and willing to forsake things that we thought we just had to have, be it our coffee or our favorite TV show or whatever. And we're going to have to cooperate with the Lord. And as we turn loose of these things, God will then burn them up. I don't believe it happens all at once. It happens a little bit at a time. and we'll find that we are just totally and completely different, have a whole new outlook on life because of the great work that God has done in us. I believe that 1 Corinthians 13:9 through 12 sums up what we have seen here in the story of Judah, this type of a believer in the end times. 1 Corinthians 13:9 says, "For we know in part, and we prophesy in part." And that's the way Judah was in his concept of God. He knew God that was someone who could meet his needs, but he didn't really know who God was. He had no understanding, so he only saw in part. And verse 10 of 1 Corinthians 13, "But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away." So when Judah had this revelation of who God really is, that stood out boldly opposite of what he had thought God to be, he said, "Let her be burnt." Let the whole old concept that he had, everything in him that was not of God, he wanted it to be done away and to be burnt. Then verse 11, "When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things." And so his life is totally different now. The things that he used to be interested in, he is no longer interested in. Things that he thought he couldn't live without, he doesn't want to have anything to do with anymore. He has come into maturity, and he's about to be perfected in Christ. And so his whole outlook on life has changed. Our concept of who God is affects how we view all of life. So the more we know God, the differently we see the situation in our life, and the more deeply we can see into other people and understand why they do the things that they do. So it just opens up so much of life to us. And yet that's just the beginning. We go on here to 1 Corinthians 13:12. "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even also as I am known." Well, I can hardly wait. I don't know what this is going to be, but it's going to be glorious. It's going to be more wonderful than anything we could ever imagine. And it's going to be the experience of the church of the end times. Those of us that are living now, that are pursuing Jesus Christ with our whole heart, we're going to come into this. And we're going to come into perfection. Something that is beyond even my ability to imagine at this point. It's going to be so glorious.